I'm joined today by Dr. Patrick Rooney. He is the Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where Dr. Rooney has an extensive responsibility leading our university and including our academic faculty of our particular college. But he also has teaching assignments, and he's here to talk to us about the faculty role that he enjoys within the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And Dr. Rooney, first of all, what led you into scholarship? What led you to pursue a career in the academy?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. So when I graduated from college, like many people, I was trying to decide between one path or the other. And at the time, I was trying to decide between going to law school and kind of a public policy route in law school, and was interested in politics. And I also was interested in economics and trying to go to graduate school in economics. And so I ended up working for an aspiring think tank in DC, and worked there for a couple of years and applied to graduate schools. And I had two children while I was in DC, and so law school became a non-option. And graduate school was offering me to pay me money, and so that made it easier path. I was also thinking about going into education, and when I started thinking about teaching in high school, that made the hair on my back of my neck stand up straight. And so I decided that getting a PhD was a smarter path. I was also interested in, because of my interest in politics and policy, I was interested in the policy dimensions of that you could get through a PhD and studying economics.
And so you have your doctoral degree in economics. We will be thankful to your children that they led you in this direction at the very start. What are some of the key themes of your research?
So, Bill, I think and so I should preface to say, my dissertation was on employee stock ownership plans, profit sharing, worker participation, and ideas that would increase efficiency and equity both. I was always fascinated by these ideas. And so, I think that my transition into studying philanthropy was also motivated by some of these understandings of how do we improve efficiency and equity in the nonprofit or philanthropic sector as well. A lot of my research in philanthropic studies has been focused around the role of tax policy issues and how they impact philanthropy, as well as the dynamics of philanthropy. So following one household over 2 decades, as well as following many households across many generations. So looking at how are millennials different from the silent generation and from boomers with respect to their philanthropy. I've also been interested in, the cost of fundraising, overhead and fundraising costs, and then in, whether or not the business cycle matters, whether or not disasters matter. So the intersection of a lot of things that are very relevant right now today.
Can you please expand on that a little bit in terms of how you reached the realization that expertise in economics could translate into philanthropy? Because, just on the surface, people might think, oh, he's a trained economist. Certainly he's going to be working in the private sector for a bank, a wealth management firm, something along those lines, or perhaps even in the government as they, forecast economic conditions or the impact of policy on economic conditions. But you saw a bridge between economics and philanthropy. What did you see?
Well, Bill, it was somewhat propitious. I got lucky in some ways, truthfully, because at the time I was working for our former chancellor, and he asked me to do a cost-benefit analysis of Indiana University's foundation fundraising costs and overhead costs. And so I looked at IU Bloomington, IUPY, and all the regional campuses, and the IU Foundation overall, and that led to an academic publication on fundraising costs. And at the time, shortly thereafter, Gene Temple was the executive director of the Center on Philanthropy at the time, and they were raising money to do a national study on fundraising and overhead costs in the nonprofit sector. And he said, well, you might be interested in leading this study and being the PI or co-PI on this. And one thing led to another, and I really found it fascinating. And after a while, I came over to the Center on Philanthropy full time as the director of research, and one thing led to another. And then, with doing that, when I came over, I started working with Mark Wilhelm and Rich Steinberg Uh, and we were looking at the creation of this panel study, philanthropy panel study, and what would be the best questions about that, and how would we design that, and what would be the power of the panel, and how what are things we needed to design in then in 2000, well, in 1999 and 2000, so that it would be useful 20 years later and longer.
So, for the benefit of our audience who are just learning about higher education, PI is principal investigator, and a member of our faculty always needs to be a lead principal investigator anytime there's a research project, especially a grant funded research project. And Dr. Rooney, you mentioned the philanthropy panel study, and this is a good specific example of how your expertise in economics translates into philanthropy. Can you help our audience understand a little bit more? To give us some depth on that particular project that then illuminates your broader story.
Sure, Bill. One of the things that is just really fascinating is the University of Michigan has this panel study of income dynamics, the PSID, and that's considered really the gold standard of social science research. They started out with 5,000 households in 1968, and they interview those same households every other year. They follow those same families. And when children are emancipated, whether through marriage or becoming 18 and leaving the household and so on, or graduating from college and then creating their own household, they become a new observation in that data set. And now there are over 9,000 households in the panel study and up to 3 and 4 generations. And so we can look at the parents' impact on their adult children's philanthropic behaviors. And we can look at how one generation differs from another in terms of their propensities to give and volunteer, and how much they give and volunteer in terms of the quantities. And so, this panel study, and it's freely available. It's a public good. We raise the money to pay for that and write a check to the University of Michigan for a very large amount. And then they post it on the World Wide Web so anybody can use it. But one of the things that's helped me as an economist is bringing to bear statistical tools that can analyze this large, complicated data set.
And so the panel study on income dynamics, income is an economic activity that is measured by economists. And Dr. Rooney found a way to translate this into philanthropy with the philanthropy panel study, which then informs how we understand donor behavior. And that's just one example of the research that Dr. Rooney conducts with our colleagues at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So Dr. Rooney, then help us understand, we've talked about your research. How did this translate into your teaching, the courses that you teach for our college?
Yeah, so Bill, I have the great joy and fun of teaching our students about the economics and public policy aspects of philanthropy. And so, some of the topics that we cover in my class are, they're largely driven by economic theory, but also empirical data and so on. So we talk about tax price elasticities of demand, which is a complicated way of saying whether or not donors are responsive to changes in tax policy. And, guess what? They are. And so people are not giving primarily because of a tax deduction, but for some people, it does affect how they behave on the margins, and both in whether or not they give and in how much they give. And so we can look at that for corporations, for households, for charitable bequest giving. And so that's a part of the class. Another part of the class is how do fundraising departments, development offices, how do they maximize their net revenue? So we look at the cost side, we look at the revenue side, and we say, how do we optimize that? And Rich Steinberg, who's a colleague of mine in the econ department and also teaches for us, developed a very clever formula for testing, this idea that is somewhat of a abstract construct in lots of ways. And so we have, an exercise that we do to measure that. We also look at, the excise tax on foundations. So we look at the unrelated business income tax that nonprofits may have to pay, and how those things play into that. We also look at payment in lieu of taxes, pilots, that some nonprofits pay voluntarily or not so voluntarily to the local government agencies. And so there are a lot of economic concepts that affect the philanthropic sector. We may not think of them as economics at play, but they really are.
due to the liberal arts nature of our school and the diversity of expertise amongst our professors, help our audience understand the experience for the students. And I want to particularly use your point about taxes to help our audience understand that. So a student may attend a course taught by one of our psychologist professors who studies donor motivation, or sociologist professors who studies, just donor activity and donor behavior. And in those courses, they're going to hear about surveys that show that taxes really don't rank so high in terms of charitable giving. And then that student walks into Dr. Rooney's course and he says, well, my quantitative empirical data show that taxes do affect charitable giving. How does that really enrich the experience for our students to learn from those different perspectives?
Yeah, so Bill, that's a great question. And, so I want to be respectful of my colleagues in psychology and sociology. But one of the things that makes a difference for economists is that we try to measure what is rather than what is perceived to be. And so now I've done lots of surveys asking, respondents what they think about things or how they feel about things, or asking them to identify, how much they've donated and why and so on. So it's not to say that we don't ever do that, but economics is different in that it really tries to focus on data that is either derived from like the IRS or the panel study. It's kind of an independent third-party providers that is measuring behaviors. And so, we can look at it on the tax question. For example, on the Bank of America study that, I helped, create and lead for several years, we asked households, high net worth households, about their donations and whether the role of taxes. And most of them say taxes don't matter. Mm-hmm. But when you look at tax records and you look at the PSID and you have years of data, you see that, yeah, it doesn't matter for some people. They behave very similarly year in and year out. Others, we see patterns where they are, I call them switchers, so that in years when they are tax itemizers, they donate more. On years when they're not itemizers, they may not donate at all, or they donate less. And so that suggests that, again, they may not be donating just because of the tax deduction. And that would in fact be silly, because you're never better off financially. If you only care about yourself, you're never better off financially from making a philanthropic gift. There has to be an altruistic motivation. It has to be part of your core value. But on the margin, it does, the tax benefits matter, or the lack of tax benefits, the loss of tax benefits also matters.
And Dr. Rooney, what does this say about earning a degree from the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy? And from my perspective, this conversation, even right now, demonstrates the complexity that we invite our students to enter into, that there isn't just this binary yes or no, black or white, that we invite our students to, synthesize a large amount of different types of information, analyze that information, and dive into the complexity to prepare themselves primarily for the philanthropic sector, but the other two sectors as well. How would you describe that student experience as our students gain all these different perspectives, including your very deep expertise in economics as economics relates to philanthropy?
Yeah, Bill, that's a great question. One of the things, so as it happened to be last night, my youngest son was sitting outside with a couple of his friends, and they had just all wrapped up finals and so on, and we were talking about things, and one of them said something about a class that did not involve numbers. That was not their preference, and one of the other ones said, "Well, numbers are a social construct," and I said, that's fascinating and correct. I mean, but if we didn't have it, our role would be much more confusing, and we'd have to develop something to approximate our current, numeric system. So we had this kind of philosophical conversation around that. I think in the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we have similar conversations, right? And in fact, numbers are a social construct. Socioeconomic status is a social construct. And there are lots of social constructs that the sociologists and the psychologists might talk about in different ways. As an economist, I'm going to measure whether or not there are differences in giving or the propensity to give by race, ethnicity, gender, marital status, parental status, and so on, the role of income and wealth and how much people give and so on. So I think, you know, our students really benefit from hearing about this very wide range of methodological approaches, theoretical approaches, and to some degree, philosophical approaches.
So when you come to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, you're going to wrestle. You're going to be asked those bigger questions. You're going to thrive in that complexity as you strengthen your understanding of the philanthropic sector, which only strengthens you for your professional opportunities moving forward. Dr. Rooney, I know you've taught at all three levels, our bachelor, master, and doctoral programs. I want to invite you now, just think of one of your courses and give us a sample, a couple, three talking points from a particular module, or, maybe it's the couple, three big talking points on the first day of class to help our audience understand even more specifically what a course with you would look like.
Yeah, so one of the things, like in my public policy and economics of the philanthropic sector class, one of the things I want students to understand is, why do we have a nonprofit sector at all? Why doesn't everything happen between the commercial sector and the governmental sector and the household sector? I think a lot of times people don't talk about the household being a sector, but I think it's actually one of the most important sectors. It's where we spend a lot of our time, we get to develop a lot of our values. Might also include that might also include the spiritual sector, and so I think this plays important roles in our society and in our families. But why do we have nonprofits at all? So we talk about the failure of the government to provide the appropriate levels and quantities of goods and services for some goods and services. Similarly, for the for-profit sector, some goods and services are inherently unprofitable. And so it makes sense for the nonprofit sector, a philanthropic sector, to create and produce those goods, because the government sector can't meet all the needs and all the variety of needs. And so we spend some time discussing that. We also look at this public policy factors like the estate tax, corporate tax, household taxes on it, and the roles that they have affecting charitable donations. And then similarly, we want to look at how do these sectors interact? And so to what degree does the philanthropic sector compete with the for-profit sector, like in nursing homes, for example, or hospitals or education? And to what extent do they compete with the governmental sector? And to what extent are all three of those competing in some sectors? And what are the comparative advantages and disadvantages of the philanthropic sector vis-a-vis the commercial sector, the capitalist sector, or the governmental sector, right? And so I think that these things are very, in some ways very complicated, but they're important if we're going to work in the nonprofit sector to understand that, we may be, very idealistic and enthusiastic about our subsector, but we also need to understand that we're not working in a bubble. We're not in isolation from the rest of society and the rest of the world.
As you can hear from Dr. Rooney's at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we go beyond understanding the nonprofit organization or how to manage the nonprofit organization, which is so essential. Our nonprofits are important and they need to be managed extraordinarily well. But you can hear from his description, we're approaching leadership level type questions and leadership level type understandings of philanthropy and the philanthropic sector. Dr. Rooney, one thing I'd like to ask you in conclusion then, how would you summarize what you hope to accomplish with students, certainly in the classroom and any other ongoing academic and professional activities and engagements you might have with students and alumni over the years? What does success look like for you as a professional and a leader in our school?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So, certainly overall for our students, I want them to be able to both understand what the big questions are and then be able to think about how to address them both theoretically and empirically, and then feel comfortable doing research about them, feel comfortable diving in and knowing what a number is, right? And knowing how to do a cost benefit analysis and knowing how to evaluate decisions on the margin in economics and applying that to the philanthropic world, but also to know about, we offer classes on the ethics of philanthropy, applied ethics in philanthropy. We offer classes on fundraising, because at the end of the day, If you're involved in the nonprofit sector and you move up through the organization, you're going to be fundraising directly, most likely, or you're going to be supervising people and working with people who are fundraisers, or you're going to be on a nonprofit board. And one of your key responsibilities on a nonprofit board is to be a fundraiser for that charity, right? So for your research. And so I think that one of the things that we offer is how to think about the big questions, how to address those big questions, and then how to wrestle with the ambiguity, right? Because for some things, there is an empirical answer, right? You know, I can give you a data set and we can calculate the tax price elasticity of demand fairly precisely. But even on that, something that seems straightforward, there is a very broad literature, right? And so how to think about what is better research and what's worse research, and how do you think about what is a credible source, credible methodological approach, what's what's just bad research, right? And or inferior research, and how do you identify that, and how do you address that not in an ad hominem manner, but rather in a methodological manner.
Well, Dr. Rooney, thank you so much for the expert way you translate economics into philanthropic studies in ways that benefit our students and strengthen them as alumni. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for all you do.
With Dr. Patrick Rooney, the Executive Associate Dean, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.